The first system we're going to discuss is the integumentary system. The integumentary system is the skin and its derivatives. That would be the hair, the nails, and the various glands found in the skin. The skin, you'll remember, is your cutaneous membrane. It makes up about 7% of your body weight, and it's anywhere from 1.5 to 4 millimeters thick. The epidermis is the outer layer. This is your stratified squamous epithelium, and it's avascular. It relies on nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. The dermis is the bulk of the skin. It's the tough layer of the skin, and this is your fibrous connective tissue. It is well vascularized, and so it can let nutrients diffuse into the epidermis. Then we have the hypodermis. This is deep to the skin. It's not really a layer of the skin. It's below the dermis and is sometimes called the superficial fascia. It's mostly made up of adipose tissue. It helps anchor the skin to muscle, and it's loose enough so that the skin can slide around a little bit. So here you see the epidermis, relatively thin, the much thicker dermis, and then that hypodermis. The epidermis is a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium with 4 or 5 distinct layers depending upon the thickness of the skin. The stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, which is only seen in thick skin, and the stratum corneum. In the epidermis, there are 4 basic cell types: the keratinocytes, the melanocytes, then dendritic cells, sometimes called the Langerhans cells, and the tactile cells, sometimes referred to as Merkel cells. The keratinocytes are the most numerous. They're connected to each other with desmosomes. Keratin is a fibrous protein that provides protection to the cells. It's our waterproofing protein. This helps keep water out of us, but it also helps keep us from evaporating. The keratinocytes arise from the innermost layer of the epidermis, the stratum basale. By the time they've hit the top layer, they are dead. They very easily shed. They slough off easily. We basically have a new skin every 25 to 45 days. Friction in an area will cause increased cell division and keratin production, so that when you have a lot of friction, you may get a callus, a thickening of the epidermis. The melanocytes synthesize a pigment known as melanin. This is a brown pigment. The melanocytes are only found in the deep layers of the epidermis. Melanin is passed on to keratinocytes and can accumulate on the superficial side of the nucleus. The purpose of melanin is to protect the nucleus, the DNA, from ultraviolet light. The dendritic cells, or the cells of Langerhans, arise from the bone marrow. They're actually immune system cells. They migrate from the bone marrow to the epidermis, where they act as macrophages. They ingest foreign substances that may kind of wiggle in between the skin cells, and they will help activate the immune response if they need to. The Merkel cells are tactile cells. They help us with our sense of touch. They are found at the junction between the epidermis and the dermis. They are associated with nerve endings. This is a nerve coming up to this Merkel cell right here, and they are sensory receptor for touch. We don't have a lot of these, but we do have other more complicated touch receptors in the dermis. The 5 layers of the epidermis are the stratum basale, or the stratum germinativum, the stratum spinosum, sometimes called the prickly layer, the stratum granulosum, the granular layer, the stratum lucidum, the clear layer seen only in thick skin, and the stratum corneum, the tough or horny layer. The stratum basale, or stratum germinativum, is where we have the germinating cells. This is the reproducing layer. This is the deepest layer, and when you look at it on a slide, it looks kind of wavy. This layer is firmly attached to the dermis and gets plenty of nutrition from the dermis, so these cells can divide. There is a single row of the youngest keratinocytes there, and interspersed among them will be the melanocytes and the Merkel cells. This row undergoes rapid cell division. The stratum spinosum, or the prickly layer, is several cell layers thick. Here the keratinocytes take on a more irregular shape. Because they're beginning to shrink down just a little bit, those desmosomes that have them attached to each other make them look a little prickly. We begin to see pre-keratin fibers in these cells. It is this area where the dendritic cells are most abundant because they have spaces between the cells that they can crawl around through. The stratum granulosum, or the granular layer, is 4 to 6 cell layers thick. The keratinocytes begin to flatten out and they accumulate granules of keratin. This is the last layer that receives nutrients from the connective tissue. These cells not only are getting far away from their food supply, but that keratin is waterproofing them. So these cells are beginning to die for two reasons. The stratum lucidum, or the clear layer, is just a few rows of flat, dead keratinocytes. It's seen only in thick skin, like the palms, the fingertips, and the soles. The outermost layer, the stratum corneum, is the cornified layer. These cells flake off easily, so dandruff and skin flakes come from this layer of the epidermis. We lose about 40 pounds of skin cells in our lifetime. Humans can shed about 50,000 cells every minute. The stratum corneum is 20 to 30 cell layers thick. It's about 3/4 of the epidermis. There are very thick plasma membranes and keratin which protect these cells, and glycolipids between the cells help waterproof. Only lipid-soluble substances can get past this layer, so when you have medical patches, medicine delivered via a patch, it's got to be either lipid-soluble itself or in some sort of lipid-soluble carrier. Otherwise, it won't get through the skin. This is the layer that keeps the external environment out and prevents water loss. So here you see sort of the picture representing it, and this is an actual microscope slide. That first layer, the stratum basale, then we have the stratum spinosum. You can see those desmosomes holding the cells together, but that gives spaces for these Langerhans cells to come through. Here's a melanocyte, here's a Merkel cell. As we go on up, we get more fully keratinized cells in the stratum granulosum. And then finally we get that stratum corneum, that really thick layer of dead cells that easily peel off, easily are sloughed from the body. The dermis is a dense, irregular connective tissue, very strong, very flexible. We have collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers in the dermis, and we have fibroblasts, macrophages, white blood cells, and mast cells present. Fibroblasts will maintain the fibers. The macrophages, the white blood cells, and the mast cells are involved in our immune response. There is a rich blood supply, there's a rich nerve supply, there are a lot of lymphatic vessels. All of the skin derivatives, the sweat and oil glands and the hair follicles, originate in the dermis. And the dermis has two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is a very thin layer. It's superficial. It's right under the epidermis. Here there's some areolar connective tissue that forms sort of a loose woven mat. There's a rich blood supply into this area because we're going to have to feed that epidermis that's just above us. Also, this is an irregular layer. We have the dermal papillae, the projections that cause an irregular surface on the epidermis. These irregular areas on the epidermis are called friction ridges and are responsible for our fingerprints. The reticular layer is responsible for most of the thickness of the dermis, about 80% of it. This is the dense, irregular connective tissue. We've got collagen fibers to provide strength. This also helps prevent scrapes from penetrating deeper than just the surface of the epithelium. And the collagen helps bind water. This helps keep the skin hydrated. There are areas where the fibers are less dense. These are called cleavage lines. These are areas where the fibers run more parallel to each other and don't crisscross as much. If you cut along these lines, you have much less scarring, so surgeons need to know where these cleavage lines are. And then we have points that are called flexure lines. These are creases at the joints where the dermis folds so the skin can't slide around too much. If you think about it, on the back of your hand, you can push your skin around, but when you get to your knuckles, that skin doesn't move quite as much. So here you see the epidermis of the skin. Here is the papillary layer of the dermis. Notice how it's a little more open looking. And then here would be that dense, irregular connective tissue that's the dermis. And you're seeing various structures that are embedded in the dermis, oil glands and sweat glands. Here are those cleavage lines, areas where we don't have quite as much fiber thickness in the dermis and where the fibers tend to run more parallel to each other. So cutting along these lines, you would cut across fewer fibers and with more fibers, so you'd have less scarring. And then here are your flexure lines, areas where your skin doesn't slide much. It'll slide in these other areas, but not at these flexure lines. Dermatitis is simply an inflammation of the skin. Any kind of rash or disorder like that would be dermatitis. Blisters occur when there's friction that separates the epidermis from the dermis. This allows fluid to collect between the two layers. And stretch marks are when the dermis tears. Either there's rapid growth of the skin, as in a pregnancy when the baby grows very quickly, or there's long-term stretching. For example, someone who carries a lot of weight in their abdominal area may have stretch marks simply because of the stretching of the skin for a long period of time. The stretch marks initially are red and then they show up as white because it's basically collagen fibers, it's scar tissue. There's a wide variety of skin color, and several things contribute to skin color. Melanin is made in the skin by the melanocytes. It runs from a yellow reddish brown to a black in color. Everyone has the same number of melanocytes, but there's differences in the color of the pigment they produce and the amount of melanin they produce, which is why we have so many shades of skin. Freckles and moles are simply areas where there's accumulations of melanin. Sunlight will increase melanocyte activity because the purpose of melanin is to protect the DNA in our nucleus from ultraviolet damage. Individuals with darker skin tones naturally have more protection against UV rays. Another thing that may contribute to skin pigment is something called keratin. Keratin is a yellow to orange pigment that's found in plants, things like carrots and sweet potatoes. Keratin is one of the things that can be converted to vitamin A and is useful for vision and epidermal health. However, it is a lipid-based substance and can accumulate in the stratum corneum and the fatty tissues of the hypodermis. This yellow pigment, for someone who eats a lot of yellow or orange vegetables, may be darker in the soles and the palms where you have the thicker stratum corneum. And then because blood is in the dermis, hemoglobin plays a role. Oxygen-rich blood is a bright crimson color, and in lighter skin, which is more transparent, that pink shows through, giving a little bit of pinkish color to the skin. Excessive sun exposure damages the skin. The elastic fibers will clump up, and this causes the skin to become leathery in nature. Also, it can depress the immune system and cause alterations in the DNA that may lead to skin cancer. Ultraviolet light will destroy folic acid. Folic acid is necessary if we're going to synthesize DNA. Insufficient folic acid is dangerous for developing embryos, which is why prenatal vitamins have a lot of folic acid in them. Some things will cause an increased reaction to the sun. This is known as photosensitivity. Some drugs and perfumes can cause photosensitivity. Things like tetracycline or antihistamines can be drugs that contribute to photosensitivity. Photosensitivity may make you sunburn more easily or may lead to skin rashes. Some skin colors indicate some sort of pathology. Cyanosis is a blue skin color that indicates that there's a low oxygenation of the blood. The hemoglobin is not as red as it should be. We usually see cyanosis in the nail beds and around the lips. Erythema is a redness. This is when there's extra blood in the dermis. This can be as the result of fever, hypertension, inflammation, or allergy. Pallor or blanching is when someone gets very pale. Someone with anemia tends to be pale. Low blood pressure will make you pale, as will fear and anger. Jaundice is when you have a yellow discoloration of the skin. This indicates a liver disorder typically. Hemoglobin needs to be broken down to be eliminated from the body. It ultimately is broken down to a substance called bilirubin, which is yellow. Your liver is supposed to discard this through your digestive system. If your liver is not functioning correctly, this yellow pigment builds up in your blood, giving the skin a yellow discoloration. Bronzing is when you have sort of a tan look to the skin, but it's not a true tan. It's kind of like a bad bottle tan. Bronzing can be seen in Addison's disease. This is when you have an inadequate steroid hormone production. And bruises or hematomas occur because capillaries under the skin become broken. Blood seeps into the tissue, and that blood eventually breaks down, again, ultimately to bilirubin, which is why bruises eventually fade to yellow, but in between the hemoglobin is a green color called biliverdin.